What I'm going to do is take this word solidarity. We have the four principles of Catholic social doctrine: human dignity, solidarity, subsidiarity, and common good. And they're all a bit vague when just stated that way. But the one that's really vague to Americans is the solidarity. And I just want to sharpen three or four meanings of solidarity in Catholic magisterial teaching, and then briefly apply it to this question of being a church for and with the poor. Once upon a time, this word solidarity actually had a clear meaning to anyone who is educated enough to know it. It comes out of Roman law. One was said to have an obligation of solidarity, an obligatio in solidum, when he was responsible, that is, liable, for the debts or actions of another. All the legal cultures of Europe formed in Roman law understood what that was. Solidarity was not a limited liability partnership. And many of the Roman legal systems in medieval and modern Europe had in their law a presumption of solidarity. And one was presumed to be in a condition of having an obligation of solidarity to another according to one's nation, ethnicity, family, religion, guild. And that obligation persists over time, allowing everyone to identify the person who was liable and the person who committed the actions for which the other person is liable to be in some kind of community together. The uncle, for example, could be responsible in solidarity for the actions and debts of his niece, who in her Paris apartment was up late at night smoking and burned down the apartment. They come for the uncle. One of the most odious things in the old regime, before the French Revolution, is that Jews were presumed to have obligations in solidarity across all of the legal cultures. So the Jewish uncle has an obligation in solidarity to the Jewish niece for having smoked the cigarette and burned down the apartment, just by virtue of being Jews. And so when the revolutions happened, let's say first the French Revolution, but it was not the only revolution. There was a century and a quarter of continuous revolutions. They made a beeline to eliminate solidarity. It was thought to be odious. That is, one should only have liability for another on the basis of a contract. So presumptions of solidarity were ruled out by the Napoleonic Code, 1801. You have liabilities only in a limited fashion based upon contract. This is the emergence of true liberalism. I mean, liberalism did not invent banking or capitalism or anything like that. I mean, the Italians invented capitalism centuries before. But liberalism did invent limited liability partnerships as a very specific alternative to solidarity. Okay. Now, it was a paradox, but having destroyed the legal notion of presumptive solidarities, the revolutions unintentionally emancipated the word solidarity. It quickly acquired a plethora of moral and ideological meanings in the 19th century. Class solidarity, solidarity of political parties or movements, sex and gender solidarity, the solidarity of humanity itself. Now, this word to American ears does sound like collectivism or socialism. But despite the way we Americans hear the word solidarity, in most of the world, it does not necessarily pertain to the state, just the opposite. It pertains to kinds of associations underneath or above or across state sovereignties. And in fact, of much of our world today, the word solidarity is used simply as a human rights patriotism, okay? Now, the Catholic Church slowly came to terms with these plethora of meanings. And I'm not going to give you the entire history, except to say John Paul II turns out to be very important in this history, since he came from the country in which the movement called Solidarity changed history. Yeah. So it's John Paul II who is really the first to call solidarity now a virtue. So let me give you some examples of his definitions of it. In Solicitudo Rei Socialis, 1987, the virtue of solidarity is described first as the willingness to take moral response to common goods. Quote, "It is above all a question of interdependence, sensed as a system determining relationships in the contemporary world in its economic, cultural, political, and religious elements, and accepted as a moral category of obligation. When interdependence becomes recognized in this way, the correlative response as a moral and social attitude is a virtue, and it's called solidarity." You know, here's JP2, all of us a century and a half after the revolution's trying to bring the term back without its odious implications. Okay. It's not limited liability partnership. It's a strict moral virtue. And it's a Christian virtue. So now he says, in the light of faith, there's a new model of the unity of the human race, which must ultimately inspire our solidarity, the supreme model of unity, which is the reflection of the intimate life of God, one God in three persons. And this is what we Christians mean by communion. Once again, not a limited liability partnership. So we can see the Pope begins by using a single word, solidarity, to flag a plurality of social virtues. And then 4 years later in Centesimus, we read, Centesimus Annus, 1991. "In this way, what we nowadays call the principle of solidarity is clearly seen to be one of the fundamental principles of the Christian view of social and political organization. This principle is frequently cited by Pope Leo XIII, who uses the term friendship, a concept already found in Greek philosophy. Pope Pius XI refers to it with the equally meaningful term social charity, and Pope Paul VI, expanding the concept to cover many modern aspects of the social question, speaks of a civilization of love." Now, that still seems to be a rather rambling definition of solidarity, right? But to cut to the chase, I've figured out at least 4 different meanings that go on since the 60s of this word solidarity. And I think I can make them clear, and I think they can be applied to this question, our question of being a church for and with the poor. The first meaning of solidarity is absolutely fundamental. It's anthropological. That is, we're all human. This is the first principle of Catholic social doctrine, is human dignity. We're not just all in the same boat together, we're all the same species. Okay. Standing out from other species and having certain rights and obligations and dignities just in our humanity. Okay. Not whether we're in a labor union or anything like that. That's the most powerful. And it's the broadest concept of solidarity. This is the foundation. It turns out to have been not completely understood, but this is the foundation of the human rights movement. The second meaning is what I would call instrumental. We are in the same boat together. That is, the life raft, whatever it is. We have common utilities and externalities that affect us all. What affects one is going to affect the other person as well. Catholic social doctrine often calls this interdependence, or in the words of Gaudium et Spes, needful solidarity. We're needful in our interdependence, one upon another, not only for the environment and the air, but 100 other things too. common water systems and everything else. The third meaning of solidarity is what I would call communicative. That is, we perform together common activities which encompass all kinds of different modes of cooperation, partnership, friendship, and association. In Centesimus Annus, John Paul talks about an ever-expanding chain of solidarity, meaning that once we learn how to cooperate with others, to be one with them in some way, that tends to spill over into other ways. I think people today would call this social capital. It's not just externalities. It's learning how you send your kid to school. If they can learn to cooperate with their classmates and with their teacher, they can probably go on to the Little League team. If they can go from the Little League team, they can figure out how to be on the high school debate team and maybe even eventually get married and conduct such discourses with one's spouse. I think that's basically what it means, that kind of solidarity. But the fourth meaning of solidarity, which popes have stressed is the most important, is communion. And here it means that what is common between us is the union itself. That is, what we love is not just that we're all human. We all love the species. What is loved is not just the commonalities and externalities that affect us all, clean air and clean water and all these kind of things. What is loved is not just our partners that we're involved with in various kinds of associations, right, our colleagues at school and so forth. What is loved is the union with the other person itself. And the Greek term for this is koinonia, or what we have called bonum commune in the Latin tradition, a common good, which in the strict sense of the term means I don't just love the other person, I love communion with the other person. So in the Latin rite of marriage, one gives consent not to the other person, but to union with the other person. Okay, that's called communia. I just don't love Jane, I love being in communion with Jane. Okay. Now, it seems to me that these four aspects of solidarity, oh, by the way, that last one is just what Father Augustine Thompson talked about this morning. Remember in John 13:34, where Jesus says, I give you a new commandment, doesn't eliminate the other ones, I give you a new commandment, love one another as I have loved you, which is not just the love of the other, but in a certain mode of union, right? So, brief commentary on the four. And they all come under this question, who is my neighbor? Which is a simple way of talking about what the issue of solidarity is. Who is my neighbor? The first kind of solidarity is absolutely fundamental. It's only nebulously social, I would say, but it's absolutely fundamental. We are, as Alistair McIntyre said, dependent, rational animals. We have these perfections. All human beings do. We're rational, free, communicative, and that at the wellspring of the human soul is a love of humanity. We love our species. We even love ourselves as members of the species. We are all philanthropists in this sense. When Thomas Aquinas talks about the first precept of natural law, it's not self-preservation. He said to conserve ourselves according to our species. I don't want to just be preserved as an onion or something, right? But as a human being. We affirm the perfections of being a human being. And everyone is our neighbor. Every human being is our neighbor according to this understanding. And the first obligation in solidarity, then, the first obligation is honor and recognition of other human beings. Or you could say the first principle is they must be included. because we share the same nature. And that's the principle of dignity. And so here, there is no subsidiarity, by the way. There's no lowest possible level to human nature other than human nature. There's no most efficient level of human nature. There's just human nature, and that's what we love. And so the first injustice or lack of benevolence to the poor is not to honor or recognize them. And by the way, this is a question of justice. It's also a question of love, but it really is a question of justice, to give to each what is his due. The most primordial giving to someone what is their due is to give them honor, honora, and recognition as human. That's solidarity. The second solidarity is also pretty fundamental. And I think it arises when we work, when we exchange and distribute with one another. Right? When we exchange with one another, we give to the other what is his or her due, and vice versa. Right? When we distribute, we do this according to merit or need. So in the family, given a finite amount of medicine, we know who to distribute it to, the sick child, not the healthy child. And in questions of politics, when we have finite police resources, we protect the weak and the vulnerable. It's a no-brainer. Morally, it's a no-brainer. Medicine to the sick child, not the healthy child. Protection to the weak and the vulnerable before the strong. This is what we owe to the poor, right? And I don't think it's a preferential option. I don't like that language in this category. This is justice. This is not an option. It's to the sick child that you owe the medicine. It's to the weak and the vulnerable. You owe the resources of the community to protect them. And the powerful will always shield themselves. In fact, they'd prefer not to exchange with the poor at all. Forget about the distribution problem. And here is a great problem in our time of scale in the global economy. We are exchanging money for labor with people we don't even know and who are not even under our laws. It raises a huge problem of solidarity. Okay. Don't ask me for the solution to it, but I can name what the problem is. Who is my neighbor? Third, solidarity. It has an actual social predicate. Teamwork. Networking, you can call it. This is what John Dennison was talking about in the Peruvian example. These kinds of associations that can be formed are marvelous creatures of human ingenuity. Social life would be deprived without them. This is social capital networking. The problem here, too, with the poor is that the poor are typically excluded from these. I mean, you have to work to get the poor included in what I would call relatively complex networks of teamwork. Right? And the results of those networks that involve teamwork are often not given for the poor. That is, the team itself are the people that benefit from it. So both the question of being for and with the poor really are raised in this third kind of solidarity of common actions and associations. The beauty of the Polish example, and John Paul II himself said this, is that solidarity in Poland, solidarity was a knowledge, it was a teamwork. People aren't just delivered by the hand of nature, knowing how to have unions of workers. And the Solidarity Union was not only a union of workers, but it came to be solidarity with the intellectuals as well. they had figured out to use their knowledge, their social capital, to include, well, clergy as well. I mean, they had ended up kind of networking the entire country. It was a marvelous instance. Finally, a society that's constituted by koinonia or communio has a different logic here, because the point of communion is to love the union with the other. We're not just loving all the good results of it, and we're just not loving the teamwork or the exchanges or the distributions. Here, the formal object of solidarity is to be one with the other. It's beyond justice. It's sustained by justice, but it's beyond justice. And this is the gospel. And I would say it's the Catholic specialty. Not that Catholics don't have something to say about our common human nature and about these other kinds of solidarity, but the gospel explicitly teaches about Jesus in friendship with his disciples. This is what I believe that Father Augustine Thompson was talking about this morning, where it means not to just be for the poor, to be with the poor, and that's where preferential option belongs. My own view, I'll stand corrected. It's preferential option because here one actually goes out to be friends with the poor. In other words, justice at those other levels can be done. And so those who identify with the poor as friends and love the friendship itself, that's a new game. And it's a New Testament. It's a New Testament practice. It includes the other three kinds of solidarity, to be sure, but it can't just be assembled in some aggregate way out of the other three kinds of solidarity. Solidarity with someone else because we have the same nature, solidarity with someone else because we have the same externalities, solidarity with someone else because we're in teams with them and networks with them. But this is solidarity with someone because you love union with them. And to be able to do that with the poor just for that reason, it may have some ground in nature and our common solidarity as humans. But if you put the word poor in, that is certainly a teaching of Scripture. So I'll leave you with that. If I've sharpened the idea of solidarity as having at least four, maybe it has others, and maybe we can chip away and make three out of them. But it's enough for one afternoon.